If you watch my video on repairing a misplaced mortise, you'll know that I use Timbermate wood filler. Now, Timbermate is an interesting product because you can also use it to fill grain, specifically on open grain wood like this Tassie Oak dining table top. The open grain means that no matter how smoothly you finish it or how high a grit you sand it with, the surface goes up and down a little bit following the grain pattern. And this will transcribe through the finish so that no matter how good a job of finishing you do, there'll still be little ripples. Now, if you're doing a gloss cover, this is quite bad because the gloss is a little bit lost when the timber goes up and down. So the best way is to fill it. So that's what we're going to do tonight. And I'm going to show you how you can use Timbermate to do it. Now, this isn't the only product. There are oil-based ones, but this is very easy to work with. It's water-based, won't affect any finish, can be dyed, although I've got the right colour for this type of wood. It can be sprayed on if you really want to. I'm going to brush it on. And it works out fairly economical. The other major advantage of filling open grain wood is the saving in finish. So if you have an unfilled piece of work that you're applying finish to, the first coat will always absorb fairly heavily into the wood. If you fill those the pores in the grain with filler of some sort, less product is being absorbed in and will sit on top like you hopefully wanted to. So I've seen claims that Timbermate will save 20 to 30% of your finish. I'm not sure how true that is, but that's interesting. So Timbermate comes in lots of different colours and varieties. If they don't match the wood that you're using, you can dye it with pretty much any dye available, be it water or oil-based, and apparently even things like coffee grinds or sawdust will work just fine too. This is hardwood, which corresponds with Tassie Oak. This is an Australian product, so it corresponds with an Australian timber. Other than that, all we need is a ice cream container to mix it in and some hot water. Apparently hot water works best. So you can thin it by about 10 to 15% by volume, weight, whatever, which is what we're going to do today. Basically you want a nice little slurry so that you can brush it on. And another nice thing about Timbermate is that there's no waste. If you don't use all the product once it's thin, you can either let it dry out, put it back in the container, or just straight up put it back in the container. It's not going to hurt the product. And if it gets too watery, add more product, or if it gets too dry, add more water. So I'm not quite sure whether that consistency is right, but I can always add more water as I go. There's no need to use gloves, but because I'm operating a camera by myself, it's a little bit easier if I can wash my hands a little bit easier. So I'm just going to load up my brush and get started. The Timbermate just gets brushed on using a synthetic brush. A natural bristle brush might have issues with swelling like with a normal water finish, so I decided not to risk it. After the entire table was coated, while it was still wet, I scraped off the excess with a plastic scraper, trying to get most of it into a plastic bucket to reuse. I let it dry overnight just because it was cold and late at night, but normally it needs half an hour or so. As you can see, it looks awful, but that's okay because we're going to sand it back with 180 grit sandpaper. This can be power sanded, but because I wanted to collect the dust to reuse it, it was a little easier for me to do it by hand. It really doesn't take much effort with 180 grit to clean off the excess filler. I'll admit it's a little hard to see, but the best way to test is by touch, not by eye. On many open grain woods, even when they're sanded to 240 grit or higher, when you run your fingernail across them you can feel it just catching very slightly. Once it was grain filled, however, it was super smooth. You can see how much from the sanding I was able to recollect. As I've mentioned, this can all be reconstituted and reused on the next Tassie Oak project that I have. So how did it come out? Well, I'd say there's significantly less polyurethane used in the first coat. Typically I find the first coat gets soaked in and feels very rough when dried, whereas this time around it felt very smooth after the first coat. And the brush didn't drag and the whole coat took far less time to apply. After the first coat, there isn't really much difference other than it feels very, very smooth. From colour point of view, it was a perfect colour match and there was no discoloration or indication that it had been filled at all, colour-wise. This video was more about the process. I'll go into more depth with the results when I've got time to prepare a filled and unfilled board when I explore French polishing and other high gloss finishes which require grain filling. Thanks for watching.